Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Today is the second talk of our Spring 2024 online lecture series of the Inter-University Research Group on Tibet and the Himalayas, or Groupe de Recherche Inter-Universitaire sur le Tibet et l'Himalaya, also known as the GRITH, which is led by Isabelle Andréandossi from here, Quebec province. And we are honored today to have Michael Eam from University of Toronto as our guest speaker. As you all know, the spring series, Tibet and Canada, Canada on Tibet, feature Tibetan studies scholars who are either of Canadian origin or who are currently based in Canada. In this respect, I want to say that Michael was the first scholar in Canada who reached out to me when Isabelle announced my arrival here as a postdoc at at Laval University in our Facebook group of the GRID. And we have never talked with Michael before. We have never met with Michael before. But we share a connection through young Tibetologists, ISYT network. And Michael was so nice and so welcoming to me when we chatted on Facebook with him, that the whole idea of holding Pan-Canadian lecture series actually sprouted from that first talk with him. So I am very grateful for having him as my Canadian colleague and for being able to present him to you today. Michael is a postdoctoral fellow in the University of Toronto's Department for the Study of Religion and the Robert Hall Family Foundation Center for Buddhist Studies. He is a historian of religion whose research focuses on the religions of Tibet and South Asia, with a particular focus on the early history of the Gelug tradition in Tibet. And the title of his talk would be Ganden Monastery's Autogenous Miracles, rangjön, a study in Tibetan pilgrimage, material culture, and discursive construction. I give this floor to Michael, and you can switch to sharing your presentation, please.
Yeah. First, just thanks so much. Merci, Natalia, Isabel, Laval University and Griff for cette opportunité. I'll share my screen now. Okay, so you should be seeing my screen. And yeah, I'm just really grateful for this opportunity. This is based on a journal article I've been kind of wrestling with for quite a while now. And it was good to have the chance to try to put the pieces together for this talk to try to make some sense of it. But definitely interested in people's feedback, comments, questions, suggestions. I just note here all of the images of rangjön from this talk are drawn from this work. This is a recent abridged guidebook to Ganden Monastery with lots of great images like these. Yeah, so my research bears on the early history of the Gelug tradition in Tibet. So just to orient us a bit, of course, the founder of the Gelug tradition is Tsongkhapa. He founded Ganden Monastery, was established in 1409. And in general, the Gelug tradition is often understood as a monastic and scholastic tradition with a strong commitment to ethics and the Vinaya, with its so-called mega monasteries with extensive social, political, religious, economic influence, and for its extensive educational curriculum that culminates in the degree of Geshe. But my research really focuses on kind of understudied aspects of the Gelug tradition, and a major one is the importance of pilgrimage. So, for example, Ganden Monastery was a really major pilgrimage site in Tibet. If we look at this map, we see Lhasa down here in the bottom left, and this dotted line is the road. So if you're traveling to or from Lhasa to eastern Tibet, you would pass by Ganden here. You would go if you're going to China or eastern parts of Tibet. Basically, Ganden's been described as a mandatory stop for any pilgrims or travelers going to Lhasa, which basically means Ganden itself was a major pilgrimage site. Just giving some basic understanding of pilgrimage in Tibet. This is a nearly universal Tibetan practice with social, political, economic, and religious factors. Alex McKay has defined pilgrimage as a human phenomena. Pilgrimage is generally defined as a journey to a sanctified place undertaken in the expectation of future spiritual and/or worldly benefit. And just focusing a bit on some religious dimensions. Pilgrimage, the term for pilgrimage in Tibetan, one common term is nakor, so circumambulating an abode of a deity. The most common practices on pilgrimage would be this sort of program of prostrations, offerings, and circumambulations. One of the functions of this practice is to cleanse oneself of defilements, drib, and sins, or dikpa, and becoming purified, or dakpa, in the process, and also to receive the blessings, or jinlab, and make auspicious connections, or tendril, to the site or deity. And one thing I would point out is that a lot of the existing research on pilgrimage in Tibet has focused on natural sites. So this is, for example, the work of Tony Huber and Katja Buchtriel. They've really focused on mountains, lakes, caves. And one way they've understood pilgrimage in Tibet as a kind of process of what's been termed the Buddhization or the mandalization of mountains. So these are ways in which existing cults of mountains, existing ideas of the power and gods associated with mountains were incorporated into Buddhist practices of pilgrimage. And from this perspective, monasteries have basically been left out of the picture. So Tony Huber has said that the great pilgrimage sites are associated with wandering hermit types, which he contrasts to monastically based scholars. Which is certainly fair when you're focusing on natural sites, but I'm really arguing for the importance of monasteries like Ganden. We need to understand that they're both monasteries and important pilgrimage sites. So our picture of Tibetan pilgrimage would be incomplete if we don't start using monasteries as important data points or case studies or what have you. This isn't really important to dwell on. These are the textual sources I used. The earliest is a catalog by the first Jamyang Shepa. Then we have one by the first Purbuchok, Nawang Jampa. Two histories of Ganden Shartse, Dratsang. And then an Annals of Ganden Monastery, and as I mentioned, the recent abridged guidebook. So many of you probably know Kate Hartman. She's done a lot of recent work on pilgrimage. And one thing she emphasizes is that the construction of pilgrimage sites really takes place via pilgrimage guide literature. For example, she describes these recurring features of pilgrimage sites, that they have an outer, inner, and secret aspect, some kind of special flora and fauna. The mountain is described as a mandala. There's narrative framing going on, associations with previous masters. And then our friend, the presence of miraculous, which he calls self-arisen phenomena. And I'll just point out, Ganden has all of these things going on, but today I'll really be focusing on the last category here. Okay, so Ganden, as I mentioned, is a really important pilgrimage site. And perhaps one of its two most famous features is its circumambulation routes, which we see here. For example, and within that, the rangjön, what Hartman calls self-arisen phenomena, what I'm calling autogenous phenomena. Basically, the circumambulation route is also called the circuit of Ganden's rangjön. That's how significant they are. That's how well known they are. Basically, they're kind of an attraction of the route. Similarly, there's a saying about the three seats of the Gelug tradition, that Ganden is surrounded by rangjön, Sera by hermitages, and Drepung by Dharma protectors. So these are really important Tibetan understandings of Ganden as a pilgrimage site. And just considering the list of, basically the Abridged Guidebook contains an itemized list of 64, we could say, attractions on the circumambulation routes. And of those, 37 are rangjön. All right, so what are rangjön? So just on the simplest level, these are significant phenomena that have arisen or jön on their own, rang. In general, it's hard to find, at least I haven't found a lot of sort of theoretical musings by Tibetan authors about rangjön, what they are, how they should be understood. The longest description I've seen, sorry, I should point out too, there's no Sanskrit equivalent of rangjön, so it's a Tibetan word, although it is closely linked to the similar term rangjung, which many of you are probably familiar with, which is the translation equivalent for swayambhu in Sanskrit. Okay, so the longest definition of rangjung I found is from Dunkar's encyclopedia, and he says, what is termed rangjön are those things that are present on the rock face where people who have a high level of Dharma realization dwell, or on skull cups and so forth. These are things like images of deities, the 6-syllable mantra, and so forth. These have come into being naturally and without needing to be made by humans. So just teasing out the significance. So what are rangjön? They comprise images of deities, mantras, and so forth. Where are they? They're on the rock face around holy beings, or on things like skull cups and so forth, which leaves me wondering, I mean, I'm presuming these are skull cups that are kind of near holy beings, maybe the skulls of holy beings or the items used by holy beings. It's not stated explicitly, but I'm sort of assuming it wouldn't be just a random skull cup of an anonymous person. And significantly, these are naturally made. They're not man-made. So, okay, so I'm trying to analyze rangjön in different ways. So I think one way we can understand rangjön are as religious icons. So here we see an image of the Rigsum Gunpo, the kind of lords of the three families. And Burks is a scholar of Christianity who's described icons as sacred images representing the saints, Christ, and the Virgin, as well as narrative scenes. In Byzantium, icons could be crafted in all media, including marble, ivory, and so forth. So I think this is definitely true in some respects of rangjön. So as sacred images representing, let's say, religiously significant persons or things. Here we see one of Sangdongma. Here we see one of a stupa from Nepal. It doesn't say which one. You can sort of try to squint and see which one you think it is or which one your favorite is. Here we see one of the famed charnel grounds from India. And also a kind of what would that be, vulture or some sort of bird like that. Of course, mani are everywhere in Tibet. Here we see a rangjön of Om Mani Padme Hum. Here we see this is a weasel, or yes, I think weasel. And then it also mentioned narratives. So a lot of the rangjön are also associated with narratives. So this is the letter Bu. This invokes a narrative where Tsongkhapa in a past life made an offering to Shakyamuni Buddha, who then sent his disciple Mount Galyayana to Tibet to bury a conch that was found at the site of Ganden. So this rangjön is basically invoking that narrative. As does this one, which I'll mention later. This is an autogenous letter A. I'll come back to this later. And then here, there's another narrative where I think it's the 13th Dalai Lama had a vision of the protector Danchen Chogyal. Just as this is the only case I found, it said rangjön occur not just on the cliff face, but also on objects like skull cups. So there's one object that, at least in the guidebook, that is this sort of object. This is the horn of a dzoma, where rangjön 21 taras appeared. So here we see one case where, yeah, it's not just a cliff face, but also other objects like skull cups, etc. And now we know etc. includes the horn of a dzoma. Okay, so one important definition of rangjön is that they're man-made and arise naturally. And this is something that, so I should say the author of the abridged guidebook, he's actually he's a monk at Ganden in Tibet. This book is, I forget exactly, it was written sometime in the past 10 or 15 years. And he wanted to apologize for the fact that rangjön are not man-made. He wanted to argue that this is true. And what he said was that basically, since the time of the Tibetan emperors, there's been a long-standing prohibition against carving and constructing mani stones along circumambulation routes. And he concludes there has never been a tradition of making or constructing rangjön. Elsewhere, so Rachel Guidoni has studied Tibetan relics. And here we see a nice example of what it means to arise naturally. So she says, if a pearl is emitted from a cave or if a deity appears on a bone, a Tibetan will consider all these emanations as being spontaneous, rangshin ne jungware. They've appeared naturally and resulting from the sacredness of the stone. And relics are an interesting kind of analog for how we can understand rangjön. For example, Guidoni has described 3 circumstances of the emission of Tibetan relics. And by relics, she's referring to dung and ringso. So the most valuable kind of relic are those that are emitted spontaneously, totally unpredicted, unnaturally. The next level are those that are kind of partly stimulated by an external agent. So for example, this could be where there is a source of relics, but also the devotee needs to have the right mindset, the right devotion. So if they have the sort of obstructions of drip, then maybe there's some interference. So it's not spontaneous. There's some kind of nexus of cause and effect. And then the least valuable, of course, still valuable, but on this hierarchy, the least are those triggered intentionally, such as when you cremate a body and so forth. And you are sort of interfering in the process to some degree. And there's certainly resonances with this understanding with South Asian hierarchies of divine icons. it's really hard to say whether this is, I mean, what the reason for this is. I won't really try to make a claim, but we can just observe it at first. For example, in South Asia, Haberman has described the way in which the natural forms of deities are more worthy of worship than man-made icons. Similarly, actors stated that the Svayambhu linga, these autogenous linga, are superior to those that are made by human sages and gods. So these would be linga that are carved from different materials. Similarly, unlike a man-made murti or image of a deity, a Swayambhu murti is superior because it's created by God himself or herself, such as Vishnu. So rangjön are kind of a really interesting kind of blend of these two categories, though, because, okay, so for example, if we think of man-made images, they're usually anthropomorphic. They're created by human artisans via traditions of production. They're created from various substances. And then one crucial difference, they require consecration or some sort of ritual maintenance, or the divine presence will never enter or can be lost. So we can contrast that with natural, not man-made images in South Asia. So the natural ones are usually aniconic. They emerge on their own, or they're the self-manifestation of a deity. They also consist of various natural substances, but instead of wood or um, whatever other artistic medium, these are natural substances, stones, trees, even anthills, things like this. And natural icons don't require any consecration. The sort of divine presence is kind of inherent to them. They cannot be lost. So rangjön are kind of interesting because in general, they're these sort of natural phenomena. The one crucial difference is that they actually are iconic, as we saw. But they're also kind of, sometimes it's hard to know what you're looking at. They're iconic, but there's a sort of vagueness to them. Like if the caption wasn't there, it'd be hard to know what you're looking at. But that's sort of neither here nor there. All right, so we understand rangjön as icons. I think also an important aspect of rangjön is understanding them as miracles. So Dempsey and Raj describe features of miracle include a sense of awe or surprise. Miracles convey the awesome power of a saint or divinity, and also contain a particular purpose or meaning for humanity. Also, it's really good to emphasize that miracles are social acts. They're a part of a web of cherished beliefs. They only make sense in the context of shared worldviews or acquiescence to the power of some kind of authority, whether it's a deity or a saint or nature spirits, whatever it is. Miracles only make sense in this type of worldview. So, for example, rangjön really makes sense as a site, as a phenomena that really marks and legitimates Ganden Monastery as part of a sacred landscape. So, what sort of awe is it meant to convey? Really, awe linked at the powerful blessings of visiting Ganden, conveying the power of Tsongkhapa and other Gelug figures. As miracles, this is really what Ganden's rangjön are really trying to convey. And then we saw rangjön should occur in the vicinity of holy beings. So This really indicates the sort of awesome power of a saint. So they have the power to create physical marks on land. One of the most visceral examples of this are beings who can actually leave the traces of their handprints or footprints in the rock. But also, there's a lot of stories where lamas kind of, because of their actions, it sort of leaves traces in the land. I'll give one example soon. And one purpose of this is to inspire, develop faith in devotees. And I think another really important reason these things happen in the vicinity of holy beings is because this is really part of the part of the construction of place that's going on at places like Ganden. That it's not an accident that these things happen where Tsongkhapa was living for 10 years, because this is really part of how Ganden is being constructed as a sacred space. So here's a really good example. So I showed this before. So basically, how are we doing on time? Yeah, so this is one of the most sort of beloved folk narratives at Ganden, I would say, which I really love. This is one of my favorite stories about Tsongkhapa and Ganden, because, like many of us can probably relate to, this event happened at a time where Tsongkhapa was really missing his mother. He had left home, I think, when he was like 16 years old, something like this. And then he was never able to return home, never saw his mother again. And the story goes, he was at Ganden one day and he heard the song of a cuckoo bird. And the cuckoo bird song reminded him of his mother. And he called out for her. I think the official version is that he called out her name, Shingsa Ache. I tend to think maybe he called out Ama. Either way, the letter A from either phrase. As a result of him calling out to his mother, the letter A was then sort of spontaneously, a rangjön of the letter A has appeared ever since. So this is really conveying multiple things. I think probably the most important thing, like many aspects of Ganden, this rangjön really invokes Tsongkhapa's sainthood, his magical power, the fact that just by calling out for his mother, he has the power to sort of affect the landscape around him to the point where the letter was spontaneously generated in the cliff. This one is curious too, because it sort of looks like something was painted here. It looks like the letter was perhaps painted. That sort of goes against the non-man-made part, so I don't really know what's going on here, but it appears to be paint anyway. Also, I mean, this is just my speculation. I feel like this story just does a lot to sort of humanize Tsongkhapa. People just can feel sort of sympathy with him. Sort of, there's a great poem by a Tibetan poet actually invoking this narrative, where she basically describes her own pain of being a mother and how she sort of had a sort of upswelling of the sort of maternal love and pain when she visited this site and was thinking about Tsongkhapa's mother and missing him. So it's really sort of active in these sort of folk kind of narratives, for lay people especially. Yeah, so basically, since these narratives are described in pilgrimage guide literature, a lot of the sort of meaning, the significance, the sacredness of Ganden is discursively constructed through these words, through these narratives, through language. And a good example of this is this story here. So this image, this isn't rangjön, this is just another of the significant items on the circumambulation route. And what's interesting is that there's different versions of what happened here. Presumably the earliest version is that what happened here is that the great Kadampa scholar Chapatriki Senge is actually from the area where Ganden is. So there's some basically what we could consider folk narratives about Chapa in the area. So this one is that he was with his mother one day, and it's unclear why, but he wanted to show his mother the sort of the faults, the defects of wealth. So he poured tea out, and when he poured the tea out, it caused this kind of gap in the cliff. I wish there was more detail. It's sort of unclear why he would do that, if his mother was greedy or not. What's wrong with enjoying a nice cup of tea? But then a later oral tradition today is that this was actually Tsongkhapa, that Tsongkhapa was there with his mother, and then his mother, oh no, sorry, I don't think his mother was there. Sometimes they're different accounts. I'll leave his mother out. At least the story goes is that people brought Tsongkhapa tea from Ganden, but he thought it was inappropriate because you shouldn't just take things from a monastery for personal use. So he poured the tea out, and that's what caused this gap in the cliff. Really, the point being, these narratives we can see are really sort of giving meaning to the site, but also since they're discursively constructed, these meanings can change over time. These things are socially constructed. And when our old friend Chapatriki Senge perhaps has been forgotten, is no longer as sort of resonant for the local people, sadly, maybe Tibetans in the area don't study the history of Songpo Monastery and the sort of great traditions of debate and the writing of Yigcha that Chapa inaugurated. Then the story can shift to Tsongkhapa. But really, the details aren't that important. As Marshall McLuhan famously said, it's really the medium that's the message. So regardless of what the details of the story are, the important thing is just showing the sort of miraculous power of Tibetan saints in the area, the sort of cultural memory of amazing, miraculous things that happened. And just that this is sort of an important place, a sacred place, etc. So I think rangjön are uniquely Tibetan in some interesting ways. So unlike in India, where Swayambhu phenomena can occur in terms of trees or like, yes, rocks, but rocks especially connected to specific Indian rivers or places or anthills. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in Tibet, it's really about the earth and especially the mountains. So Axel Michaels has described the way in which the environment, rivers, forests, mountains, rocks, etc. in Tibet are considered to be animate in some way, have subjective beings in some way, and to have the power to make an area auspicious or dangerous. Similarly, there's an interesting way of understanding mountains. Tony Huber has described that mountains are self-produced or rangjön. They're spontaneous, lungidrup, which is kind of akin to being sort of naturally produced. And so possess an innate natural power or empowerment or blessing, jinlab, from which mountains gain their high status. So it seems to me that rangjön are kind of a way to partake of this uniquely Tibetan way of understanding mountains as having this innate natural power, which is really useful when you're trying to sacralize a monastery, a place that might not have this sort of natural charisma or power, but then you can sort of incorporate rangjön and sort of partake of these sort of important Tibetan understandings. Similarly, Katie Fitzgerald has described the way that in the area of Bongwa Mema, There's hundreds of small-scale sacred sites that contain just really significant cultural memories. So there's traces of the origin story of the Zhong clan, where there were, like many of these types of stories, sort of a conflict between a hero and demons. And there's traces in the landscape of these things. So I think that's part of it too. Like the sort of rangjön are just a way to sort of preserve and retell the stories of, oh, this is where Tsongkhapa conquered the demons, or this is where Tsongkhapa missed his mother, and so forth. And then rangjön really indicate the centrality of the Lama, which is a really defining feature of Tibetan Buddhism. For example, a lot of rangjön are associated with Tsongkhapa, or maybe one of the Dalai Lamas or Khedrubje. So rangjön appear as a result of lamas, not the case like in India where rangjön or Swayambhu phenomena appear really because of deities. It's Vishnu, it's Krishna. So there's kind of a difference there. Yeah, the last thing I'll say is that so sadly and interestingly, so Ganden Monastery was largely reduced to rubble during the Cultural Revolution. But in the 1980s, when Tibetans were allowed to start rebuilding, Tony Huber visited Ganden sometime in the 1980s, and he found that crowds of pilgrims were still continuing to visit the site and perform circumambulation, even though all of the buildings, as we can see here, were in ruins. So what's going on here? So I think this is a really important way that rangjön functioned in Tibet. So thinking of the way that Huissan's notion of the palimpsest quality of places, the way in which a place's prior identity is both effaced and perpetuated by new constructions. So yes, Ganden's buildings were destroyed. Ganden's buildings had to be reconstructed, which obviously shows the way Ganden's identity was both effaced and perpetuated. But there was something deeper going on for Tibetans. Even if you destroy Ganden's buildings, its important status as a sacred place, a miraculous place, a place with blessings, is really broader than the buildings and sacred objects themselves. And Katie Fitzgerald has also described the way in which it's really the ongoing continual actions of visitors continually visiting a site that makes and keeps a site sacred and renews it. So in the 1980s, these visitors to Ganden were not merely partaking of the site, but really helping to keep it alive with regard to a whole constellation of beliefs and practices related to this crucially important Tibetan Buddhist pilgrimage site. So just thinking about the way that Conradson describes that in collective ritual, the past is remembered through reenactment, or the physical repetitions of actions that are conceptions of belief embedded in materiality. So just really thinking of the importance of rangjön as material objects in the cliff face that couldn't be destroyed, even if they bombed and reduced Ganden to rubble. There's something there in the materiality of rangjön that really allows for this collective memory to be kept alive. So I would say in the past, rangjön were really important to help construct the site of Ganden as sacred. Then in modern times, they help Tibetans remember and revitalize their heritage amidst the ruins of Ganden as enduring, miraculous, and material reminders of the power of Tibetan gods, lamas, and stories. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this comprehensive and very interesting presentation on rangjön. I was actually thinking, and I have a few questions, but I think it would be better if I first give the floor to others, if somebody else wants to ask a question first. Anyone? Katie?
Hi, thank you, Michael. I have some selfish questions, which are just about a couple of things I want to read that you mentioned. Could you say a little bit more about the poet that you mentioned who talks about Tsongkhapa's calling out to his mother, which is such a compelling story, and also the this Hussein, if I'm saying this correctly, the sort of multi-layered like nature of sacred spaces. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? And then the Michael's references that you mentioned, this sort of mountains or spaces being like subjective beings. I don't know, is this part of a sort of like neo-evolutionary theoretical framework or doing something else? I'm really interested in when geographical spaces like are treated as humans or deities or given subjective agency.
Yeah, definitely. And I cited Katie's work in my talk. So in the chat, I linked the poem. This is a really beautiful poem that invokes that narrative I mentioned. And is translated by Lowell Cook. So really, another thing I emphasize when we think about Ganden as a pilgrimage site, I think it's important to understand that this is really what helped grow the Tsongkhapa cult in Tibet. Tsongkhapa has been described, I think it might have been Tucci or another visitor to Tibet, remarked that there's basically almost as many statues of Tsongkhapa, images of Tsongkhapa, as Padmasambhava in Tibet. So this cult really grew exponentially from where it began. And I think a lot of it is this importance of Ganden as a pilgrimage site, sort of devotional aspect of practice, the practice of lay people. And we can sort of see that evident in this really beautiful poem that was written to commemorate the 600th anniversary of Tsongkhapa's passing. Yeah, the Axel Michaels quote, I'd have to dig into it because I might question whether the landscape are subjective beings or whether he's sort of conflating maybe, because I think we can all agree the landscape is animate to some degree, alive in some ways, subjective beings. I wonder if he's conflating a god who lives on a mountain with the mountain. To be honest, I'd have to dig into it to see. And as for the sort of palimpsest quality of the landscape, I can send you that reference, but off the top of my head, that's one of those ones that I got from a third source. So I've been trying to pull a lot of pieces together for this research. But it's definitely something we can discuss more. It's really an interesting topic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tashitsiring, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I wanted to thank Michael and and you all for organizing this, and Michael for the excellent talk. It was really interesting. I appreciate the breadth of research you have done, and you brought to us different, not just what you have found, but also different scholars' perspectives on rangjön. And I agree with your main arguments that you are making in this talk and this paper that you're working on. I was wondering, it seems to me that there is a need for detailed and sustained study of the production of rangjön, rather than seeing rangjön in simply as different this phenomena, and which are categorized as self-arisen and all these different categories, and overlooking the most how should I say the most obvious assumption that at least the scholars would have, is that these most of these are produced. In fact, some would argue all of them are produced. Maybe some of the images that appear are natural, but it is produced in the sense that humans have ascribed meanings and stories and narratives on these images, right? And that act of ascription of these stories to these shapes, odd shapes, and giving them into a letter or a symbol of an animal or what have you, that act, I think, ought to be studied, should be studied in much greater detail than studying rangjön as this curious phenomena. For two reasons. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just asking, if there are others who have done that, because it seems to me this is really important, that needs could be done. Partly, to demystify and to unessentialize the Tibetans as these people who are believers of those things, but more importantly for our own knowledge, right? And to better appreciate the human agency, the creativity, the credit that needs to be given to the Tibetans for producing so many of these rangjön for various purposes, such as you mentioned in the case of relating to Tsongkhapa. He is not just a historical figure, but a mythical one. And the rangjöns have played a very important role in that, and which is what actually makes these Tsongkhapa comparable to Shiva, for example, or Vishnu, for example, because Tsongkhapa is not just a historical figure, but actually a mythical one at the same time, right? And the rangjöns have played an important role. And these people who have created these rangjön, whether actually secretly chiseling on the rocks and making things appear that way, or just giving, coming up with narratives and stories on them. And that kind of study, I think, would be very interesting. And I think a lot of people would appreciate that. Anyways, I was just wondering about that. And these are just some thoughts that I had. Again, thank you for your excellent talk, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you raised some interesting points. Definitely, I would agree that rangjön are discursively constructed, but their sort of meaning, the way they're understood by Tibetans, narrative is a really important part of it. And something I didn't get to in my talk, I might try to look at, would be kind of comparisons between rangjön and petroglyphs. This is sort of cave art, cave sort of drawings and so forth. We see in places like Gandhara, or I just saw in China, there's interesting cases of, yes, the explicit carving of.
That's a great connection, yes.
Of images from the rocks. So that could be interesting. It's something I hope to have the time to look at. I do think, so just in general, there's different ways of studying religious phenomena. When you're studying things like magic or miracles or things that maybe some people in modern times might be skeptical of, or as I think you mentioned, something like demystifying them.
Mm-hmm.
People have their own approaches to these things. As a historian, I try to avoid sort of inserting myself into the picture. Like, I sort of prefer to take these phenomena at face value. So, for example, if I'm studying magic, I don't feel the need to sort of bracketed by suggesting that magic is implausible, or that this is somehow some sort of belief that needs to be demystified. I just sort of take these things at face value. I'm just sort of describing the fact that some people in many cultures think magic exists, think miracles exist, think that deities can manifest as rocks and trees and so forth. So that's my preferred approach. It could be up to someone else in the future. Maybe they'll do some kind of fancy scientific analysis of a rangjön and find something shocking or mundane. But that's for someone else to do. It's not my preferred approach.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Thank you. I was just wondering if this was some of my thoughts earlier, and I was just wondering if others have done work on, looking at, all these phenomena as actually produced, and how the people have, and why, in looking at simply the production of these things, as you mentioned, and as we know, it is, it's almost industrial in scale. There's so many, every nook and corner, hills and cave, right? Every village have all these amazing stories, right? And it's just very interesting. It's definitely worth studying in greater detail, I think, particularly in the role that these phenomena have played, not in your case specifically for the, how should I say, glorification and mythicization of and people and the role of mythicization of Tsongkhapa specifically, and then creating making the monastery as a sacred pilgrimage site. But just like that, it has a similar role. Is things are happening all throughout the plateau, specifically mainly around the Himalayas, right? Whether it's for Guru Rinpoche or this saint like the Milarepa, or so. And I completely agree with you that these places have become like sacred pilgrimage sites and things like that. But looking from a broader aspect, it's actually really interesting that there are so many of them, and the purpose, the broader function it served, social, institutional function, and the creativity of the people, the leaders, so to speak, who are members of these institutions, right? Institutional practitioners, so to speak. Again, thank you very much.
No, thank you. And the last point, the fact that the author of the abridged guidebook felt it was important to say these things are not man-made. There's never been it's basically been prohibited to carve these things since the time of the emperors. The fact that he felt compelled to write and state that, yes, that there were some people who thought that these things were artificially man-made, who he was sort of responding to. I think that's fair to say.
Thank you, Tashitsiring. Thank you, Michael, for your reply. We have a question from Anthony Scott in the chat, who has applauded your fantastic talk, and who has a question. I don't know, Michael, I would read the question yourself. How would you prefer?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm happy to do so. I just can't see myself on I can speak with Michael in person though, since I'm here in Toronto. So if anybody else wants to ask a question, because I realize you're out of time, so I'm happy to just kind of hold that and speak with Michael.
No, we would be happy to have the question announced for all.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Natalia and Michael. Fantastic talk. I'm a scholar of Theravada Buddhism, so I know next to nothing about this, so it's all very wonderful and exciting for me. But I'm interested in that guidebook and how these guidebooks kind of frame the experience of these rangjön, and in particular, the idea of photographing these, or even drawings or paintings of them, and how that either transfers or mollifies or kind of, inflects in a different way some of the power ascribed to them. And then the guidebooks and what kind of narratives they're saying and the history of the guidebooks in general. Because I'm assuming that modern one is an updated version or drawing from different kind of textual lineages.
Yeah, it's a great question. So something that's interesting is that the earlier pilgrimage guides I mentioned don't talk about rangjön very much. So Jamyang Shepa's, I think, only lists a few of them. I think Purbuchok also only a small number. Nothing compared to the modern works. And I've sort of wondered why. I think part of it is sort of modern publication, just the fact that it's cheaper and easier to produce a book. I've also wondered, it's really hard to say, like in the 1700s, were there the same amount of like 40 rangjön, or were there only 5? It's really sort of a mystery. I've wondered whether someone like Jamyang Shepa just thought, oh, these are just sort of oral traditions, just what lay people do, or just if you want to know about these, you can just ask people when you come. Like, we don't need to write about it. Another thing that happens, I mentioned the one example, a lot of the narratives change. Like the version of a story you see in one text will say it's about like someone like Chapa Chukisenge, and then later it becomes about Tsongkhapa or Kedrubje. So these things change too. And it's really hard to say. Like I wish we had more information from earlier, but the only detailed descriptions of rangjön that I've found are from like post-exile. Actually, well, I guess I should say 19th, 20th century at the earliest. This guidebook that I mentioned is a fascinating piece because this is almost like an updated modern tourist guidebook. So this is a sort of a twin between a pilgrimage guide and a tourist guidebook. For one thing, it includes images that a lot of pilgrimage guides don't include. Another great thing about this text, it's dual language, Tibetan Chinese. So it's clearly designed for a lot of Chinese tourists to read and be attracted by. And then it makes claims completely geared towards tourists. So it says something like, I don't know if it's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands visit Ganden every year. And there's like 6 beautiful like minivans or buses, and they never get into an accident. So it makes claims like this. But I'm really grateful that this book exists because it's really the only one I found that has images of rangjön in this way. But now you make me wonder the interesting point of like, if you take a picture of a rangjön, does that contain blessings or not? Now I know, Tony, you've worked on photographs of sort of gurus. That's actually, I'm going to ask like some geshes about that. If you see a picture of a rangjön, does that contain blessings? That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, please follow up with me, and thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Can it be considered a blessing to, oh no, like, is it producing a blessing if you take a picture?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've never really thought about it. But I know I think Tony's work has shown that a picture of a lama is kind of like an icon, or kind of like a holy object.
Well, these are good questions. If I may say a few words here, I'm not a scholar of, rangjön in general, but as a Tibetan and a Buddhist, I have some intimacy of understanding of the cultural and religious practices. Specifically touching on your question, for example, one time we were watching a video And in the video, someone was introducing these rangjön images, and the video was paused, and my family members, did prostration, and the answer, short answer is yes. And a lot depends on the people, their motivation, right? And so if, for example, you take a photo and you are completely neutral and you just took a photo for sake of having a copy, but someone who sees this, would, if people believe in these phenomena, it becomes sacred, and they might put the photo, for example, on the altar, right? And of course, needless to say, but there are others who actually might take photos, and these people might be people who actually believe in these phenomena. And of course, and for them, the photo itself is sacred, like, images of God or cross or Dalai Lama's photo, for example, things like that. It's kind of similar. Anyways, I just thought I'd just share this story from my perspective.
It was very interesting. I really appreciate your comment.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
I also have some thoughts. First of all, I would like to say that it was very, very broad and very interesting. And when in the beginning we were discussing, Isabel said that it's Buddhist studies, and we are a little bit out of the context here, like me and her. But when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking that it's not pure, for me, it's definitely not purely Buddhist studies, because I have some experience of Buddhist studies from like Russia, for example. And this is not it. For me, it was a very interesting combination of religious studies, some anthropological approach, discourse studies, history. So I would never qualify it as purely Buddhist studies. And I think this multidisciplinarity, multidisciplinary approach makes it especially interesting and on point with recent scholarly thought. And while I was thinking about it, I remembered that I don't know, maybe you know or not, Trine Brox from University of Copenhagen. She has, I think, her most recent project was on the materiality of also Buddhist, I don't know, culture, Buddhist objects, and Buddhist waste. And I'm not very deep into what they're doing now. I haven't followed it for a while, but it kind of reminded me of that. And I thought that maybe you just will find it interesting to check out what are they doing at the University of Copenhagen, because I think they have like a contemporary Buddhist studies center, but which is based on studying the materiality and the production of Buddhist culture. So this is one thing that I wanted to say. And then you said that there was a prohibition on carving since like the times of the emperors. Was there a reason given why there was a prohibition? How it is explained?
Yeah, unfortunately, there isn't. It's just a very terse statement. I don't know if this was an actual prohibition. I don't know if this can be found somewhere.
So it's not like it's verified by some decree or I don't know. No.
No,
Okay.
it's just very terse. It's really just, I think, one sentence, maybe two sentences. I wish there was more information. And yeah, thanks for the materiality point. I think is really interesting. Like I mentioned, I think there's interesting parallels between relics and rangjön. Also, Tony Huber has described parallels between pilgrimage sites or pilgrimage, the sort of abodes, the nei, and the receptacles, the supports, the ten. Some sort of similar ideas where kind of the deity and the physical material part, whether it's a statue or a mountain, sort of similar logics of like inhabiting, pervading the material space with the sort of blessings and power. And I'll give a shout out. We're exploring materiality more in a great symposium I have organized coming up on Buddhism and the body in Tibet. But I do think this is, it seems to me, and I know some of you are working on this, I think materiality and the body are really interesting ways or sort of avenues of studying Tibetan religion and culture in the future that maybe haven't been emphasized as much to this point.
Thank you. I was actually thinking when you said about the prohibition, I was thinking that I was just trying to analyze, and you said that you take things as they are, not trying to discuss like if it's a miracle or not. But I was just thinking that some of those rangjön definitely do not look spontaneously arisen. So if there was somebody who broke the rule, who broke the prohibition, and who did some carving, you know, he had to be protected, like the master narrative had to be protected. So you cannot talk about this breaking the rule. You just have to repeat time after time again that it's prohibited. So even this, even if it doesn't look natural, it is still spontaneously arisen thing.
I think that's right. I think
Yeah.
by definition need to be natural, spontaneous, not man-made. But what's interesting, you reminded me, on the same pilgrimage route next to rangjön, you'll see, for example, an image of Tsongkhapa that was carved by someone's fingernail. So you can have a carved one right next to the rangjön, but so that's just noteworthy by itself. But they do seem to be separated. Like this one was drawn by a fingernail, yes, miraculously, but carved by a person. And this one is a rangjön, it was not carved. It's interesting. You just made me realize the sort of juxtaposition of that is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I find it interesting too. And I was also thinking that, you know, if it's a pilgrimage route and you need to have your attention focused. So these things, these images, these icons, and the narrative which is behind them, it helps keeping your focus. It helps keeping the pilgrims entertained on the route. And it helps reiterating the story, which contributes to the reveration of the of Tsongkhapa and so on. Just a second, I'm checking my notes. Yeah, and I think my last question was it was related to what Tashi Tsering said in the very beginning, so it's cleared. But thank you so much. It was very interesting, and I'm just checking the chat if somebody else wanted to say something. Okay, Anthony has promoted that. Okay, Tinley has a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and also Jeff had left an anecdote in the chat.
Okay, but first, Tinley.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate for the program and also Michael for the wonderful presentation. One thing I wanted to discuss and know further is that as you pointed about the Dempsey and Raj and their work on the miracle, the idea of miracle, and this remind me of my childhood time. I grew up in a town back in Tibet, and we had a river, and nearby the riverside, there happened one Mani Rangjön, money mantra that came out of Norway on a rock. And then we were told that because this is a good time, time is revival, our time is really is great, and its conditions us to have this beautiful natural, happening that's why it's a good time. But then later on, almost after 7, 8, I think it should be more than 8 years, that Mani Rangjön actually disappeared out of nowhere. And then we were told that now the time is again degenerating, and our social moral actions are really causing bad things. That's why even the natural things are negotiating with us, and we have to behave well. So my idea was that all these social actions, social beliefs actually dictate the very emerges in very happening of this kind of idea. So Rangjön, it's very beautiful to know it's not even rangjön. I mean, as you pointed out, it's a rangjön that comes out naturally. There's no subject behind this action. So if you say cut or go, there's an individual behind who cut or who go, right? But rangjön is just something that happens. There's nobody behind it. But again, this term is also detected and actually controlled by social norms and social beliefs and religious narratives happening. So how far these social norms actually dictate this very idea of rangjön, and how far that could be again explore further. That's something I want to know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because rangjön, on the one hand, are kind of timeless, like sort of primordial manifestation of the land kind of erupting. But also there's often a clear historical context, like Tsongkhapa missed his mother, he called for her, and that's the specific time and place that the rangjön appeared. So rangjön seemed to always have this sort of hybrid nature, this kind of dual nature. But you raise an interesting point, because I've never heard of a rangjön disappearing and how that's sort of understood. And that's really interesting to think about, like with your work on sort of ecology and sort of good times and bad times. And yeah, that's a really interesting case that I haven't come across. Of course, at Ganden, they would never want to talk about rangjön disappearing. We're trying to preserve the Ganden, the Gelug lineage. So even after the bombing of Ganden, those rangjön survived. But I guess it makes me think, well, yeah, it's interesting because, yeah, explaining the disappearance of the money in terms of the sort of bad time, it's in terms of like you mean like sort of Kali Yuga sort of time? Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, social degeneration understood more like if human become too greedy, and if you are not really following all the social norms, specifically talking Buddhist concept, and you are just really creating this world very chaotic, and any bad thing can happen. And that also caused the disappearance of very holy things, so-called rangjön, right? So these things are actually largely dictated by very social religious perceptions that also can change from time to time. Yeah. And I really like the idea that you talk about demysticization, because miracle, again, I should say miracle could be again understood in a very non-contextual, non-Buddhist contextual, because as I pointed out, and social norms also indicate that the better you behave, or let's say the more generating or more or let's say socially, religiously well-preserved, well-practiced society, then you have this kind of rangjons. And when you really don't behave well, then we have bad chaotic society, and also this social chaos can create bad impact. So the very karma, and the idea of karma is also playing this social, detection. And then miracles are not just happening anytime. This is also determined by social conditions, right? So my argument here is that miracle could happen out of nowhere, right? Here, miracles are not something that can happen anytime. Here, the social norms, social beliefs actually condition it. So that's why I don't feel comfortable using the miracle when all these things are actually dictated by very action of the people. So yeah.
Yeah, although the benefit of using terms like icon or miracle is basically just tapping into and making this sort of relevant and current for scholars of other religions, for example, just sort of partaking in the sort of religious studies discourse. But definitely, yes, it's important to sort of contextualize that to Tibet or to every context for sure.
Yes, we have a question which is written in the chat, but also just my small question before, following Tinlei's comment. Do this rangjön from Ganden and hereby Tsongkhapa's narrative, are they actually revered by followers of other Buddhist traditions? Are they considered as powerful as for those who are from the Gelug tradition or not?
So I haven't been there in person and I haven't interviewed pilgrims there, but I would bet a lot of money that anyone who goes to Ganden, so Ganden really became a sort of universal pilgrimage site, like anyone traveling to or from Lhasa. And like I mentioned, Tsongkhapa really kind of rose to the level approaching Padmasambhava, just like a real sort of universally revered Lama. So I would bet a lot of money that anyone who visited Ganden would at least have respect for. I mean, maybe the levels of devotion and so forth would vary, but like I mentioned, I think pilgrimage is really kind of universal, like regardless of your sect or gender or whether you're ordained or lay. I think everyone can sort of partake and yeah, obviously people get different things out of it. Some people might have more levels of devotion or be more interested in one particular site, but I think it did raise to the level of one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Tibet.
Just wanted to say that I think one of the like great values of Michael's work is that like when we tend to study Gelugpa traditions and institutions like from the perspective of philosophical treaties, and when we do that, then this really highlights the sort of sectarian nature and the like divisions. And I think like that what's so interesting about Michael's work in general is like studying Ganden and Tsongkhapa and the Gelugpa tradition from other vantage points, from these sort of historical and anthropological vantage points, like actually shows a different picture, which is that the general population, even the general monastic population, is really not all that invested in these kinds of philosophical sectarian divides, but rather are invested in the sort of I shouldn't say miraculous, but the sort of maybe effervescent or the sort of
Ritual.
Ritual maybe. I'm thinking more just the like magnetic nature of figures and places like Tsongkhapa and Ganden, or great monasteries or great ne as well, that are sort of maybe beyond the scope of sectarian division.
Thank you.
Oh, I'll give another shout out because Trinley and I also will be part of a panel at the next IADS on Tibetan pilgrimage. You can look forward to that one.
Okay, we now have two ads from Michael on the upcoming events to look forward to, but it's good. The question from Jeffrey Kupchik is about miraculous oral and oral manifestations, natural manifestations of sounds. Michael, are you reading it, or
yeah.
like the interaction with aura, sonic aspects of rangjön, such as the echoes received in certain sacred places, the need to be quiet and reverential and listen. Also the playing of sacred instruments that have such rangjön effect, like playing of the horn, playing the instrument restricted to those who are allowed, if anyone, as a way of worship and experiential transmission of blessings.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I know you can't speak right now, but I never realized the horn of the Zoma. Is that something people blow? And if so, when and why? Because this horn of the Zoma with the 21 Tara rangjön is very mysterious. I've never seen a single description of it or story about it. Even when I asked a couple of Ganden Geshes, they were like, I don't know where, I don't know anything about it. So if you were Trinley, you were nodding. The horn of a Zoma, is this a ritual object that's blown? Like, can someone shed some light?
I really cannot tell much about this, but yes, there are like male part and the female, right? And so the horn is just normal one, but the Zomo's horns are somehow considered or treated to be important, and also I'm not sure in terms of spiritual term, but in social terms, I'm sure it is Zomo itself is considered very important and holy, as Indians believe cow is the holy one, because in Tibetan context, Zomo is somehow not in from religious perspective, but more from the social in terms of milk production, in terms of the very obedient, very easy one that all the farmers and the nomad can actually handle easily and produce a lot of work, produce a lot of milk and other product. That's why the Zomo is treated in a very special animal apart from other rest of the herd. So from that point, I can say all these things. Otherwise, from the spiritual point of view, I have no idea about that. Yeah.
No, that's great. Did anyone else have? Yes.
Yeah, so likewise, thank you for your very, very complete, actually, overview of how we can approach this phenomenon from different perspectives, like Natalia was saying. And it's really rich to think of it as both a receptacle of the divine presence, but also in more anthropological or ethnographic, let's say, perspectives, as you have shown, and also the importance of narratives. So I was just seeing Jeff's question here. I'd like to push you a little bit more. Actually, before I say that, I'd like to say how much I really enjoyed your reply to Tashi Tsering's question about how to approach miracles as a scholar. I think it's a very sensitive question because, as you know, there is an implicit judgment in using the word miracle. And as a non-Tibetan studying Tibetan traditions that seem irrational or not modern enough in a way, it could be pointing a finger to Tibetans as being not quite on the same page, let's say, as us modern people over here. So it's very sensitive for a non-Tibetan, but I think it's also sensitive for a Tibetan point of view. I would just like to share a little anecdote. I was traveling through Kham with a very urbanized, educated scholar from Amdo. And we were going through parts where there's a lot of these rangjöns and a lot of stories. And he was not skeptical about the rangjöns per se, but he was a little bit more skeptical about the stories. And then at one point, he turned to me and says, wow, these people in Kham, they really still believe these stories, huh? Because we don't anymore. And so I found that a little bit disturbing. Like there was this kind of inner hierarchy, or I don't know, sort of category. So I was also struck in your talk of how much these rangjön objects were in the past. Have you at all heard about new rangjöns or rangjöns emerging in exile, for example, that would fill the same social role? Or, is it an ongoing tradition of sparking devotion? Or are there today other means of sparking devotion and bringing people into the Dharma?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, just on the first point. Oh, and Jeffrey, I'll get back to. Sorry, I'll get back to that. But yeah, the first point, I do think. So I'm a traditionalist and a historian by temperament, and I do think just by virtue of the sort of interactions with Tibetan Buddhism, post-exile, and interacting with Westerners and Asian people from different countries. Just anecdotally, I've also noticed a similar kind of, don't know exactly how to put it, but just sort of maybe feeling almost embarrassed about like sort of magical elements or stuff that isn't modern or scientific, which I can understand, but I also think it's not, when we talk about magic and miracle in traditional Tibetan culture, we can't really avoid it. I mean, it's not something that we can avoid. And instead of explaining it away or trying to sort of minimize it, I just take it at face value. I think for me, that's just the most honest way of engaging with these things. And perhaps the best way from a normative perspective of that. Who am I to make claims about whether miracles exist or whether science is some sort of superior epistemology? I'm a historian of like 15th century Tibet. These things are not within my purview. And I wouldn't want to make claims about things that many people are deeply held beliefs. I think it's really important to be respectful of religious communities when we study them. It's a great point about whether, so I haven't been able to spend much time at Ganden, either in Tibet or India. It would be really interesting. I'm not a ethnographer. It would be fantastic to go and see, were there any new rangjön after the Cultural Revolution? Are there any new rangjön in the newly established Ganden in India? Those are fantastic questions that hopefully we can address one day. But I don't have an answer right now. But it's a great question. And then going back to Jeffrey, sorry, Jeffrey, I think the sort of oral aspect you mentioned, for me, it's kind of all of the magical powers of Tsongkhapa, for example, are kind of parallel or similar, like his power to leave footprints in the rock, his power with his speech to leave the letter A in the rock, his power to, like his tooth emanates relics. I don't think I would isolate the sort of spoken, the voice part in any special way. I think these are all powers of these saints to just affect the physical environments with their body or with their speech. So that's how I would understand it. I hope that answers.
We'll see if Jeffrey, okay, replies. Maybe not isolate the sounds and orally, but perhaps to include mention of these aspects of the sensorium.
Yeah, so that would be a broader paper. That's something I'm also interested in, like the sort of, I presented this at a conference recently, talking about the miraculous aspects of Tsongkhapa's bodies, multiple bodies. So if I ever get around to finishing a book, that will be part of it, is what I'll say.
We hope so. Yeah, and I want to comment from myself that I really wish Jeff was here speaking instead of writing. But thank you for your questions, Jeffrey. And there is also a question from Xiao Han, who commented on Isabel's question and asked how and why people believe this, and in what sense it shaped the narrative surrounding the rangjön.
Yeah, and I like this quote. She also mentioned, men define situations as real. They are real in their consequences, by Thomas, or the Thomas theorem. I think this is a really good counterpoint to understanding rangjön as miracles, because for Tibetans especially, they're also very mundane. They're sort of the sort of facticity, like a rock is very tangible, and a miracle in a rock is sort of undeniable. Like it's very real. It's not like a vision. Um, so that's something I want to emphasize too. Like rangjön really matter because it is the rock, it is the mountain. It's real, it's tangible. It's almost an undeniable miracle. Like you just look at it and it's undeniable. Um, and I think that's what gives them a lot of their power, sort of based on this Tibetan understanding. Like, yes, our landscape is alive. Our mountains have power. And then the rangjön appears in the mountains, rocks, and it's just sort of kind of an undeniable part of their world and worldview.
Thank you. Is
It's
there
just I was just going to add, I have a sort of question. What you were just saying, Michael, made me think of this, like the framework of the like Trulwa Truk, the six liberations, the liberation by hearing and touching and tasting. And one of the questions I always have about this model is like, are these mechanisms that are utilized like due to our, like the practitioner's inability to sort of just understand philosophy on its own? Like, are these like supplementary models that then that, like, yeah, I've heard in conversations with lamas about the production of sacred space that they're used as a support, or as a way to propagate the Dharma, or as a way to reach illiterate masses, or as a way to sort of cause a kind of production of faith in the general population. So it would be interesting to see, like, from a philosophical perspective, what those like Chorwa Truk, what purpose they're meant to play, and are they like supplementary to teachings? Are they maybe even in some cases superior to the teachings themselves, if you can, sort of spontaneously create liberation just by contact with particular like sacred entities? So maybe that's like a helpful thing to look at.
Yeah, it's a great question. James Gentry has studied this in depth in his book. It's kind of curious that Buddhist scholars have felt the need to write about, like in Gentry's work, you had scholars kind of offering philosophical defenses of the liberation by seeing and hearing and so forth. But unless I've missed it, I haven't really seen that sort of discussion for rangjön, which makes me think that rangjön are really sort of kind of devotional, kind of, I won't say lay, but definitely kind of more universal, and maybe something you just don't need to, everyone just does it. You don't need to sort of defend it. That's my sort of thinking. Like on pilgrimage, I can't imagine people want to hear like extensive philosophical defenses. They're just trying to see the stuff, interact, receive the blessings. So that would be interesting though. Like if I wonder how someone would write a sort of philosophical defense or justification for rangjön. And that's sort of what makes this article I'm trying to write so difficult. I mean, I appreciate Natalia's compliments. Like I am trying to approach them from a sort of multidisciplinary perspective. And that
And
makes it really, I think it ends up in an interesting piece, but it's just really difficult to sort of bring all these things together. especially when I don't have much Tibetan material to kind of, the Dungkar encyclopedia entry is really the longest definition I found, and it's only a handful of sentences. So, yeah.
In some contemporary, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Mine, yeah, you go ahead and I will.
I don't know anything about your sources, but in like contemporary Naik, in these pilgrimage guides, oftentimes there'll be some reference to this Trolwa Trukta, the like liberation through touching, like a rectrol. So even though it doesn't give like a very satisfying explanation of what that actually means or in what context that framework is like emerging out of, I think there's at least some reference here to the idea that like pilgrimage and contact with these, like whether it's rangjön or just other kinds of sacred spaces, is part of that framework. But you, historian, I hope you find maybe some more material on where that framework emerges from. It could also be non-Gelugpa, I don't know.
That's what I was going to say. That might be a sort of maybe Nyingma kind of framing.
Could be.
But stupa is meaningful to see, Ganden, which Dan Martin was suggesting is similar to sort of liberation by seeing. But I don't know how explicit, and they never say that sort of thing about rangjön, at least in the text. I don't know what people talk about when they're there. But yeah, it's a great question for sure.
Can I add a question onto this one? Like it's more like an ethnographic one. It would be worthwhile to see if the pilgrims would be lay and monastic in an undifferentiated matter, or as far as I have been able to see, it's mostly lay people who do these pilgrimages. So what would the monks either think or be taught about these rangjöns? Are there sort of vehicles for the laity, but not for them? Is there a difference or not? Yeah, more ethnographic questions for you.
Well, I can say, so Kate Hartman wrote a great article, I think it's called Against Pilgrimage. So she was talking about diverse Tibetan perspectives on pilgrimage. And she does cite some Gelug sources basically saying monks shouldn't do pilgrimage. You should stay at your monastery and study. I asked a Gelug monk about this, and he said, that's fair, but it's really just sort of something for when, it's almost like when you're in university, like don't take a leave of absence, focus on your studies so you keep going. But that doesn't mean like plenty of Gelug monks do pilgrimage. It's just sort of like, especially while you're studying, you shouldn't do it. And maybe it's something that's said, but not everyone necessarily follows. And this is, of course, probably largely focused at monks at like Sarah, Drepung, Ganden, and so forth. Also, just from kind of modern pilgrimage guides like Keith Dowman and Victor Chan, one thing that's interesting is they do describe the existence of some lay rituals at Ganden that are very common in Tibet that aren't included in the sort of scholastic pilgrimage guides. So for example, there's one common one. It's like the black and white rocks. It's like some sort of, I forget exactly, maybe you like try to fit through the rocks and it tells you if your karma is black or white. Very common sort of lay pilgrimage rituals, that stuff like that is not in the sort of scholastic pilgrimage guides I've seen. So there's clearly something going on there. But I don't know if these were things that have been present at Ganden since the beginning or when they developed. There's a lot more questions than answers about those sorts of things.
Thank you. Is anyone else? Does anyone else have a question? What I wanted to say before Katie's last reply, I just wanted to say that I think what you presented to us today what you have already written in your paper, it is enough. It is enough as it is. You just put this brick in the general, knowledge in the scholarship of Tibetan studies. And then you take the next step and you continue. You have another paper, You don't have to put everything in this just one. You have so much more opportunities and time to do more. And it will be more, we will have more because you will put this first paper and then you do another one.
Yeah, it's a good point. I spent a shocking amount of time on the journal article draft. Somehow I spent way more time in South Asia before I even got to Tibet. And I had to ask myself, what am I doing? So I appreciate the feedback. I do hope to finish this article draft this year for sure. But yeah, at some point you just need to stop.
Yes, please do. We are waiting. You have to make a wall that you promise us to have the draft, to have the paper ready this year.
I think I will make that pledge. We'll complete it this year.
Thank you. We will check up. I think, yeah, Jeff says that he agrees that this is solid work. And he's very grateful for what you are doing. I don't know, should I read or because Jeff personally to me, he sent a message that his question has been answered. Therefore, maybe I just leave it as it is. And if anybody else has something to say, please do. Otherwise, I would like us all to thank Michael for this deep, engaged discussion of his topic. And I have enjoyed it a lot. And I think most of the people have contributed. And I don't know, we are almost doing it for 2 hours, and it feels like everybody is still so full of energy. So thank you. I would like to announce also our next lecture next week. It will be Tashi Tsering from Montreal University, and he will be giving us a brief survey of discourses on water resources and hydropower development in Tibet, which are very important now in the context of what is happening. So we will be very much looking forward to listening to Tashi Tsering and having Tashi Tsering next week.